A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away.
Here they come.
Star Wars.
Coming in too fast.
An adventure unlike anything on your planet. It's an epic of heroes and villains and aliens from 1,000 worlds. Star Wars, rated PG.
Now playing. Check newspapers for a theater near you.
Hi everybody and welcome to Geekfest Rants. My name is Carlos Perone and today I'm doing a solo show about a gentleman who might not be very well known on regular genre circles, but when you start kind of digging deep into the Star Wars, for example, side of Star Wars circles, depending on how crazy of a Star Wars fan you are, this is a name you might recognize. Charles Lippincott. Now, I would say that I'm a pretty big Star Wars fan, not only what you see on screen, but behind the scenes. You know, I like the making of, and I like the merchandising, and I like, all of the things that surround these films and television shows and all that stuff. So, I'm pretty well versed at that, as are some of my friends. So, in a way, if you had to kind of rank Star Wars fans, from 1 to 10, I would say I'm probably somewhere between an 8 and 9. There are people that are even more knowledgeable than me, especially people that are very focused on one specific aspect of the film. There are people that are experts on the film themselves in terms of what's happening on the screen, who says what they mean, who they're looking at, that kind of thing. There are people that are experts on the behind-the-scenes stuffs. There are people that know all about, who shot the film, what was the DP's name, what was the assistant director, the assistant, every little aspect of that. On the world of merchandising, that's like a whole other universe. There are experts on action figures. There's expert on prototypes, experts on books, expanded universe material, comic books, clothing. That's when you kind of reach the Steven Sansweet level of, collector, the type of person that knows a lot about all the different aspects. So I would kind of say that to know the name Charles Lippincott, you probably would have to be somewhere between a 7 or higher as far as Star Wars savvy people are. Your average one-level Star Wars person, you casual viewer who is somewhat familiar, that name will not be on your radar. But when you start to get to this level of trying to understand the phenomenon, not just what you see on screen, but the reason and how it is that things associated with Star Wars end up where they do. So, like I said before, toys. Why are there so many toys? How did these toys come about? Why is it that there's magazines, comic books, novelizations? How is it that these things ever surfaced or got, put on the market in the first place? That's when Charles's name starts coming up. So let me give you a little more background in terms of, as I said before, as much as I consider myself to be a big fan of Star Wars. Now, Charles has done many other films like Alien, Flash Gordon, Judge Dredd, Conan the Barbarian. These are pretty big movies, and some of them are, to me personally, they're milestones. They're markers in genre filmmaking. I mean, some of these movies I absolutely love with as much passion as I could. They're very different. Sci-fi, fantasy, they're kind of all over the place. Horror, sci-fi horror. I mean, these are excellent, excellent movies that Charles had something to do with, but not necessarily what's happening on the screen. Now, his expertise is basically in the area of licensing and marketing. And during Star Wars, he got to do probably the most amount of all those things because Star Wars was a smaller film than your average film. And because Lucas wanted, more control of what he was doing and what was going to be happening with this film afterwards, he kind of didn't want to leave it up to the studios to decide what would be a fair amount of money, I guess, that he could make from the possible marketing of a film. You got to, again, remember, In the 70s, marketing, merchandising, that sort of thing, the merchandising aspect wasn't that hot when it came to sci-fi films. You know, they've dabbled in successful sci-fi, such as Planet of the Apes, for example. But that was kind of like their last example of something that could be somewhat merchandised to a certain extent. What became of Star Wars, the monstrosity success of Star Wars, nobody could predict. But because Lucas wanted to kind of keep his hands, especially on the merchandising side, Charles was the person brought in to handle that sort of thing. Now, once again, as I said before, his name didn't come on the radar, as far as I'm concerned, in my scope. I've read plenty of books, official books, somewhat not official books, and his name would pop up here and there. But I would never actually make that connection in terms of saying, oh, that's interesting. Oh, that's just another person. You got to remember that these companies, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of employees, and you never really get to sit down with one of them and really dig deep into what their role was and the detail involved in this role. So all these years, the name might have drifted in and out of books, or even, making of documentaries, his name might have popped up in there, but it could quickly drift away. Ironically, a little over 30 years ago, I think, I probably almost met the man in a way. I attended the 10th anniversary Star Wars convention in Los Angeles, California, which I've mentioned a number of times. And during the George Lucas appearance at the convention's gala, Charles was there. There's a famous photo, amongst Star Wars and Star Trek nerds like myself, of Lucas shaking hands with Gene Roddenberry. Gene Roddenberry was like a surprise guest to congratulate George, on his 10th year anniversary of Star Wars. And there's a photo of them shaking hands. And the man behind them, in between them shaking hands, it's Charles Lippincott, who's there clapping because earlier on he had come out and said a few words about Star Wars. By that time, he was already not involved in Star Wars, but they were bringing in like people that in the past, you're talking about a 10th anniversary here, were kind of there to talk about, the accomplishments and that sort of thing. Gary Kurtz was there, which again, he was not longer involved in Star Wars, and neither was Charles, but they were bringing in like, this is your life type of people, But again, even, back then, I still did not understand who Charles was that well. Back then, I was still more into the film itself, and I hadn't gone, into deeper levels of the making of the film. So about a year ago, I think it was, on Facebook, I joined a lot of Star Wars related groups on Facebook, not only toys, but behind the scenes and, archival photos and this and that. Somewhere on Facebook, that picture, because it had Charles in the background, somehow between some other person that I was communicating with, Charles kind of jumped in the conversation. And it was such a interesting little exchange. Because sometimes, when somebody comments on something you say, you click on their name and try to find out who this person is. And then I clicked on it, and then it opened up his Facebook page. And, oh boy, you see Star Wars, you see this, you see that, you see the other. I'm like, wow, this guy really knows what he's talking about. This guy's pretty... And then, you read a little further and you're like, wow, this guy is the man who... was involved in all these things. And specifically the toys. I mean, my God, you guys know how I am about Star Wars toys. Just like my friend James, we absolutely love this stuff. And to be able to, through social media, communicate with somebody in little bits and pieces, being able to ask him questions, sometimes, he can reply, being able to comment on similar interests and that sort of thing, it's an amazing thing. That little exchange that we had between a small group of people kind of encouraged me and gave me the idea of starting a secondary Facebook group about the 10th anniversary of Star Wars, where I went in there and started posting as many photos that I had of that convention that I went to back in '87. And a lot of people have been contributing to it throughout all this time. And it's a great thing because every now and then somebody discovers the page and they come up with some weird pictures I've never seen before, and we post them and that sort of thing. And it's cool that Charles was there for that. As I said before, even though he was no longer part of it. So as you start to explore Charles's page, like I mentioned before, you do find out he will start posting stuff about Flash Gordon, the kind of artwork that he still has left having to do with the design, let's say, of the posters or this comic book related thing, conceptual drawings, Judge Dredd, all the pictures, all the behind-the-scenes photos that he still has. Star Wars is an endless amount of information he has about toys, about contracts, about logistics, about litigation, about you name it, licensing agreements, disagreements. And one of the things that made his page very interesting was at the time that his goal seems to be that this Facebook page that he created seems to be a way of archiving the knowledge that he has. Now, Charles is an older man. He's retired. He's no longer in the business. But he's trying to, I believe, catalog in some shape or form all these things that he's done, in that business, specifically these big major motion pictures that he participated in. And one of the things that he seems to come back to is the fact that a lot of these stories are becoming myths. The myths that certain things didn't cost as much as they did. The myth that so-and-so did this work and the fact that that person didn't do it. Those kind of inconsistencies that get repeated, especially on the internet, where an article will pop out of nowhere. And I'm sure I'm guilty of doing it sometimes. I'll see an interesting article and I'll share it. But the article might be inaccurate, for example, and the wrong person might be taking credit for something. And this is something that's, especially with Star Wars, seems to have happened a number of times with Charles. Now, Charles is very honest about a lot of aspects of his life on his Facebook page. One of the biggest things is the fact that he is in the beginning stages of Alzheimer's, and that by him being able to catalog all this and archive all this, he's trying to kind of do this before his illness affects him too much that he can no longer do it anymore. So he's trying to kind of get his facts straight on the record in a way. But it's a little difficult. Facebook is not a very reliable, orderly type of medium. I know a lot of people, including myself, have suggested and begged for him to write a book, put it on paper, put it somehow on paper. There are many things that he had done for Star Wars that were supposed to turn into something else. At one point, he was supposed to write the definitive making of book of Star Wars, the type of book that years later, a couple years ago, Rinsler put out with the help of Charles's materials. But Charles never got to do it himself, which is, I'm sure, a very frustrating thing. So in this page, through the long time that I've been reading it, you will run every now and then into things that happen. There's arguments that pop out of nowhere sometimes where it's his page and he's trying to make a point and people sometimes argue with him and you see this back and forth fireworks take place. And you're like, okay, let's just relax here. Everybody calm down. But the main point here is that there's this wealth of information here. The material that he has in these files, he has apparently tons and tons of boxes full of all types of documents, all types of pictures, some merchandise, some toys. He's got a lot of stuff that Star Wars fans just drool over. And he's taking the time, like I said, to catalog it and let us know all about it and the history behind it. Charles seems to be a pretty private guy. He doesn't do many interviews. Part of the reason, I imagine, would be that just like Star Wars fans in general, the manner that Star Wars gets covered by the media, the general media, it's usually relegated to goofy, weird stories. So in other words, if you have a fan who's an avid collector of something, whether it's action figures, scripts, books, whatever you call it, most times you do an interview, most times you watch an interview, the anchor is usually kind of like smirking and kind of giggling through the interview. They're never very serious about it because it's kind of like a soft, funny little story. Oh, look at this. John Smith here is a collector of Star Wars Lego bricks. And, there's a lot of things he could be doing with his life instead of this. They kind of take this snarky little attitude about it. So that might be part of the reason why you don't hear too much about him in terms of his involvement, because his type of involvement is the type of thing that is so niche and so, like I said earlier, a higher level or a deeper level of motion picture, a film fan, especially Star Wars, that, to get the proper respect, I think it's kind of difficult to find people that would give you that amount of time, and respect, like I said, of the work you've done. Well, I'm hoping that in the future I'll be able to talk about some of the different veins of his work. Like I said before, Conan the Barbarian. I mean, I absolutely love that film. His I want to know more about his involvement. Exactly how many things did he do? Some of these films are very difficult to market and to promote and to merchandise. When you have R-rated films like Alien, he was very limited in the amount of, well, how much merchandising can you do about an R-rated movie, especially in the 70s? It's very difficult. But Star Wars was like the prototype. He was able to do way beyond the amount of work that on the other movies he was allowed to do. And the stories are just endless. One of the things he did before the movie opened was to go around certain conventions, science fiction conventions, and to present what was coming. This was a common practice, I guess, back in the 70s and maybe in the early 80s, where you would show up to a convention. You might have a slideshow with you, show some pictures of, in this movie, this is what we're going to do. But he also had, at this particular convention, props. He had costumes and some of the props of the film there to people to look at. Some of these events, he would bring in Gary Kurtz might be there. Some of them, Mark Hamill might be there. This is before the movie comes out, so people don't know exactly who these people are. But to have, a Lucasfilm representative with official props, with pictures, with actors, with crew people, production people there promoting to the fans directly. This isn't Comic-Con, insane madness that it is now. This is, head to head with the fans trying to stir some excitement. He did a number of these. So what's happening in a couple of weeks is that Charles is going to be attending a convention. It's called the Mid-American 2, MAC 2 as it's called. This is basically the 74th Worldcon. This is a big convention that happens every year where they announce the winners of the Hugo Awards. This is happening in the Kansas City Convention Center in Kansas City, Missouri on August 17th to the 21st of this year. And what he's trying to do there as a presenter, I guess, as a participant, he's trying to recreate the exhibit that he would bring around to these other conventions to recreate, his presentation. He's going to do a slideshow. He's going to do kind of like a Q&A type of thing, having to do with that. He's going to try to bring, I believe, Alan Dean Foster, who was the ghostwriter of the novelization, to talk about how that whole deal came about. He's going to talk about the comic book, how he made the deal with Marvel to get Chaykin to do the art and how it all came about, all the different pitches he had to do and the rejections and then to come back and do it again and all that stuff. He's going to talk about how the comic books and the beginning of the merchandise started rolling in as the movie was coming to kind of prime the market a little bit. With Kurtz, he's going to hopefully talk about the actual rollout of the film, how they started to see the positive reaction and the actual money starting to come in and the demand for merchandising starting to really bubble up to the point where they could not keep up with the demand, of Star Wars. How he handled the post-release period, the planning of what to do next, starting different branches of merchandising materials like the expanded universe, that sort of thing. At some point, I'm sure he'll talk about the Kenner deal. I mean, that is a pretty infamous or famous deal that was made having to do with Lucas, keeping the merchandising rights, especially to the toys, the action figures, in exchange for a lower, I guess, upfront salary, luckily turning into what it did. And that is a monstrous amount of merchandise that came out of this. And how ironically, a lot of these things kind of led to his departure with Lucasfilm, with George. The different stories that are out there having to do with exactly how much money was the deal for. Did they get a good deal? Could the deal could have been made better? All the, the Monday quarterbacking stuff that happens, after deals are made when you realize what a huge success something like Star Wars is. So my hope is that, and I have a feeling they might be doing something like this, is that when this presentation happens in the next few weeks, somebody will record it there. I believe they already have some kind of setup for recording it. Hopefully this will be available for all the different people that are following Charles to be able to see this presentation, because it's almost like recreating history, one of those conventions you wish you could have been there, before Star Wars became what it is. So I would definitely recommend, if you're a Star Wars fan, this is like a graduate course in terms of how much material is in there. Now, you got to also keep in mind that this Facebook page, not only is it about his career, those highlights, those big events, filmmaking events, it is also about his personal life and his personal beliefs and his politics. So I would say tread carefully. If you happen to be receptive to his particular politics, you will not probably have any problems with it. I personally, I'm pretty much on his camp when it comes to that sort of thing. But yeah, I understand that some people might get turned off because you might not agree with some of his personal beliefs, opinions. But if you focus on the Star Wars or on the Flash Gordon or whatever it is you're into, it's an unbelievable, incredibly wonderful resource. Like I said before, I'm really hoping that he somehow puts this down on paper. All these files that he has, I wish they would end up in a museum somewhere or a school or a place where the public could could come visit them and look at them. It might be a little unrealistic, but for people that are into Star Wars and especially some of these films like I am, this stuff is just gold. It's really unbelievable what this man has done for the success of this movie. I mean, obviously, George Lucas is the creator of the films, but just like, we admire the producers of the film, the composer of the film, the special effects people, to forget about, the actors. I mean, there's so many people that have played a role, a very significant role. I'm on the opinion that the things that Charles was able to do in the promotion and the marketing and the licensing of Star Wars, you could say, well, anybody else could have done it. Well, yeah, anybody else could have written the music. Anybody else could have acted. But because it is so special to us now, you have to give the credit to the people that actually did it. And he did it. Toys that I'm still collecting at this age, the nostalgic feeling that I have for all of that vintage stuff that, I grew up with and a lot of people did, that's where it started. He is one of the people that deserves 100% of the credit. And like I mentioned before, take a look at his Facebook page. There's a webpage, blog, that I believe one of his fans started called therealcharleslippincott.blogspot.com. So that's a place where you might be able to find a different version of what you see on the Facebook page, but somewhat cataloged in a possibly easier manner. It's updated every now and then, so for the most up-to-date information, I would suggest going straight to his Facebook page. And like I said before, if you're in the area, if you're into Star Wars, if you're around, try to make it to this presentation he's going to make at this convention. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to do a couple of more episodes focusing maybe on specific topics having to do with Charles Lippincott. One last quick note, please take the time to take a look at MetroCon. MetroCon is coming to Tampa, Florida, and we'll be there to enjoy the show. Check out this anime and cosplay extravaganza from July 21st to the 24th. We're going to be there. Get a peek at its intriguing programming at www.metroconventions.com and look for a Geekfest Rants episode on the world of cosplay in the near future. So on behalf of everybody here, I'd like to thank you for joining us, and we will see you soon here at Geekfest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Rated R. Starts Friday at a theater near you.